Cruel husband abandons wheelchair-bound wife in the snow. 1 year later, while trying to steal her inheritance, he discovers she survived and is now a billionaire. The revenge that will leave you breathless. Grace Sullivan stood at the front of the conference room, her heart racing as she presented the final designs for Millbrook's new community center. At 40, she was at the peak of her career as an architect, known for her innovative and accessible designs. The board members nodded approvingly as she walked them through the plans. "And here," Grace said, pointing to a 3D model on the screen, "we've incorporated a sensory garden that's fully wheelchair accessible." She glanced at Robert, her husband of 15 years, who sat in the back of the room. He gave her a thumbs up, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. As Grace wrapped up her presentation, the room erupted in applause. The board chair stood up, shaking her hand. "Exceptional work, Grace. We'll be in touch soon with our decision." Driving home that evening, Grace felt a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "That went well, didn't it?" she asked Robert, who was behind the wheel. "Yeah, great job," he replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Grace frowned, sensing the underlying tension in his voice. Before she could probe further, a set of headlights blinded her. The screeching of tires filled her ears, followed by the sickening crunch of metal. The next thing Grace remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, the steady beep of machines surrounding her. A doctor stood at the foot of her bed, his expression grave. "Mrs. Sullivan, you've suffered a spinal cord injury," he explained. "The impact has left you paralyzed from the waist down." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She looked at Robert, who stood silently by her side, his face unreadable. In the weeks that followed, Grace's world shrank to the confines of her hospital room. Physical therapy sessions left her exhausted and frustrated. Each small victory, sitting up on her own, transferring to a wheelchair, was overshadowed by the enormity of what she had lost. Robert visited daily, but his demeanor had changed. Where once he had been attentive and affectionate, now he seemed distant, almost resentful. Grace caught him checking his phone constantly, his brow furrowed as he read messages. Finally, after a month, Grace was discharged. Returning home, she was confronted with the reality of her new life. The house she had designed now felt like an obstacle course. Robert had made some hasty modifications, a ramp at the entrance, grab bars in the bathroom, but it wasn't enough. "We'll need to make more changes," Grace said, struggling to maneuver her wheelchair through the narrow hallway. Robert sighed. "Of course. Whatever you need." But his tone suggested otherwise. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that he saw her as a burden, a complication in his life he hadn't signed up for. One evening, as Grace worked on adapting some of her designs to be more accessible, she overheard Robert on the phone in his study. "I can't keep living like this," he whispered urgently. "We need to figure something out." Grace's hand froze over her sketchpad. Who was he talking to? What were they figuring out? Before she could hear more, Robert emerged from the study. Seeing her, he quickly ended the call. "Just work stuff," he said, not meeting her eyes. Grace nodded, pretending to believe him. But inside, a seed of doubt had been planted. The man she had married, the life they had built together. Suddenly, it all felt precarious. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Grace confronted the harsh realities of her new world. Her body had betrayed her, robbing her of the independence she had always prized. Her career, which had been on an upward trajectory, now hung in the balance. And her marriage, once a source of strength and comfort, was showing cracks she couldn't ignore. Grace closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She had always prided herself on her ability to adapt, to find solutions to complex problems. But this was a challenge unlike any she had faced before. As sleep finally claimed her, one thought echoed in her mind. How would she rebuild her life from here? The night before their 15th wedding anniversary, Grace and Robert's home echoed with raised voices. Their argument, which had started over dinner plans, had escalated into something more. "You don't understand how hard this has been for me," Robert shouted, pacing the living room. Grace, seated in her wheelchair, felt her frustration mounting. "Hard for you? I'm the one who can't walk, Robert." Robert ran his hands through his hair. "That's not what I meant. It's just, everything's different now." Grace wheeled closer to him. "We can work through this. We just need to talk more, maybe see a counselor." No, Robert cut her off. I can't do this anymore. I need some air. Before Grace could respond, Robert grabbed his keys and stormed out. She heard his car start up and drive away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. An hour later, Robert returned. His demeanor had changed. He seemed calmer, almost detached. I'm sorry about earlier, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. How about we go for a drive? Clear our heads? Grace hesitated, then nodded. Despite the late hour and the winter chill, getting out of the house seemed like a good idea. Robert helped her into the car, carefully stowing her wheelchair in the trunk. As they drove, Grace noticed they were heading away from Millbrook. Where are we going? She asked. Just for a ride, Robert replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They drove in silence for over an hour. Grace watched as familiar surroundings gave way to the outskirts of Hartford. The streets became less populated, the buildings more industrial. Suddenly, Robert pulled over on a deserted street lined with warehouses. I need to check something, he said, getting out of the car. Grace watched confused as Robert walked to the trunk. She heard it open, then close. A moment later, her door opened. Robert, what? Before she could finish, Robert was lifting her out of the car and into her wheelchair. Grace's confusion turned to alarm as he wheeled her to the sidewalk. Robert, what are you doing? He stepped back, his face a mask of determination and something else. Was it guilt? I'm sorry, Grace. I can't do this anymore. You'll be better off without me. Grace's mind reeled. What? You can't be serious. Robert, please. But he was already back in the car. Grace watched in disbelief as Robert drove away, leaving her alone on the cold, dark street. For several moments, Grace sat motionless, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Then, as the reality of her situation sank in, panic set in. She looked around frantically. The street was deserted, the warehouses dark and silent. The winter wind bit through her clothes. She hadn't dressed for an extended period outdoors. Grace tried to steady her breathing, to think logically. She needed to find help. Surely someone would be around, even at this late hour. She began to wheel herself down the sidewalk, her arms quickly tiring from the effort. The street seemed endless, each building as dark and unwelcoming as the last. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Grace spotted a figure in the distance. Hope surged within her. Hello, she called out. Please, I need help. The figure paused, looked in her direction, then continued walking, disappearing around a corner. Grace felt a wave of despair wash over her. She called out again, her voice echoing in the empty street, but no one appeared. As the night wore on, Grace's mind raced through memories of her life with Robert. The day they met at a charity auction, their first date, the proposal on the beach, their wedding day. And then, more recent memories, the arguments, the silences, the growing distance between them. How had it come to this? How had she not seen it coming? The cold seeped into her bones, her fingers growing numb on the wheels of her chair. Grace had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. The independent, successful woman she had always prided herself on being seemed like a distant memory. As dawn began to break, casting a gray light over the unfamiliar street, Grace faced the harsh reality of her situation. She was alone, abandoned by the man she had trusted most in the world, left to fend for herself in a hostile environment. For the first time since the accident that had changed her life, Grace allowed herself to cry. Tears streamed down her face as she confronted the enormity of her predicament. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a small part of Grace's mind began to work on the problem at hand. She was an architect, a problem solver by nature. Somehow, she would find a way out of this. She had to. As the city began to stir around her, Grace steeled herself for what lay ahead. This was not the end, she told herself. It was, though she didn't know it yet, the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would test her in ways she had never imagined. As the morning sun began to warm the cold streets of Hartford, Melissa Johnson hurried towards the hospital, her night shift finally over. She was looking forward to a hot shower and sleep when she spotted a figure in a wheelchair on the sidewalk. Melissa approached cautiously. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Grace looked up, her face pale and drawn. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Let's get you somewhere warm," Melissa said, taking control of the wheelchair. "I'm a nurse. I'm going to take you to the hospital, okay?" Grace didn't respond, her mind still reeling from the events of the night. She allowed Melissa to guide her wheelchair, too exhausted to protest. At the hospital, the emergency room staff quickly took charge. A doctor approached Grace, clipboard in hand. "Can you tell me your name?" Grace remained silent, staring blankly ahead. "Ma'am, we're here to help you," the doctor persisted. "Can you tell us what happened?" Grace shook her head slightly, retreating further into herself. As the medical team worked around her, taking her vitals and checking for injuries, Grace's mind drifted to happier times. She remembered her and Robert's first vacation together, laughing as they got lost in Paris. The memory of his smile, once so warm and loving, now felt like a cruel joke. "Ma'am, we need to know if you're on any medications," a nurse said, interrupting Grace's thoughts. Grace turned away, refusing to engage. She couldn't bear to explain what had happened, to admit the reality of her situation. Hours passed. Grace was moved to a private room, still refusing to speak or cooperate with the hospital staff. A social worker visited, trying to coax information out of her, but Grace remained silent. As night fell, Grace found herself alone in the hospital room. The events of the past 24 hours replayed in her mind. How could Robert have done this to her? How could she have been so blind? Anger surged through her, quickly followed by a wave of shame. She was Grace Sullivan, a successful architect. How could she let herself become a victim? The thought of anyone knowing what had happened filled her with humiliation. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. A police officer entered the room. "Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked. Grace's head snapped up at the sound of her name. "We were able to identify you from your fingerprints," the officer explained. "Your husband reported you missing this morning." Grace let out a bitter laugh. "Did he now?" The officer looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Sullivan, your husband expressed concern about your mental state. He said you've been unstable since your accident." Grace felt as if she'd been slapped. "He said what?" "We need to know what happened last night," the officer pressed. Grace shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I can't talk about it." After the officer left, a nurse entered with a tablet. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to access your medical records. Can you log into your patient portal?" Grace nodded numbly, taking the tablet. As she navigated to the website, she noticed an alert from her bank. Curious, she opened it. Her heart sank as she read the message. A large transfer had been made from her joint account with Robert, leaving it nearly empty. Grace's mind raced. Robert hadn't just abandoned her. He had taken everything. As the reality of her situation sank in, Grace felt a mix of emotions she'd never experienced before. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a potent combination of fear, anger, and despair. A part of her wanted to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. But a stronger part, the part that still clung to her pride and dignity, refused to admit the truth. She was Grace Sullivan. She didn't need help. She could handle this on her own. As she lay in the hospital bed, Grace made a decision. She wouldn't be a victim. She wouldn't let Robert destroy her life. Somehow, she would find a way to rebuild. But first, she needed to get out of this hospital. She needed to think, to plan her next move. When the nurse came in for her evening rounds, Grace finally spoke. "I want to leave," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. The nurse looked surprised. "Mrs. Sullivan, we really think you should stay for observation." "I'm fine," Grace insisted. "I want to be discharged." As the nurse left to fetch the doctor, Grace steeled herself for the battle ahead. She didn't know how, but she would find a way through this. She had to. What Grace didn't realize was that her journey was just beginning, and that sometimes accepting help was the bravest thing a person could do. Grace sat in the hospital's counseling room, her wheelchair positioned across from Dr. James Chen. The therapist's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Grace's tense posture. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Dr. Chen," he began. "I specialize in trauma therapy. The hospital staff is concerned about your emotional state. Would you like to talk about what happened?" Grace remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. "I understand you're an architect. That must be a fascinating profession." At the mention of her career, Grace's eyes flickered up. "It was," she said quietly. "Was," Dr. Chen prompted gently. Grace's hands tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. "I don't know if I can do it anymore. Not like this." Dr. Chen nodded. "Let's start there. Tell me about your work." Over the next hour, Grace found herself talking more than she had in days. She spoke about her projects, her passion for accessible design, and the challenges she'd faced since her accident. As the session ended, Dr. Chen made a suggestion. "Tomorrow I'd like to try something different. Have you ever done art therapy?" Grace shook her head. "It can be a powerful tool for processing emotions," Dr. Chen explained. "Give it a try." The next day, Grace reluctantly agreed to participate in an art therapy session. Dr. Chen set up an easel adapted for her wheelchair and provided various art supplies. "Draw whatever comes to mind," he instructed. "Don't worry about skill or technique." Grace stared at the blank paper, feeling foolish. But as she began to draw, her hand seemed to move of its own accord. Lines and shapes emerged, gradually forming the outline of a house. Dr. Chen observed silently as Grace worked, her focus intense. When she finally set down the pencil, the drawing showed a beautiful modern home with wide doorways, ramps, and an open floor plan. "Tell me about this house," Dr. Chen said. Grace looked at her drawing, a mix of emotions crossing her face. It's the house I always wanted to build for myself, accessible, but not clinical, a place where anyone could feel at home." "It's beautiful," Dr. Chen commented. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into it." Grace nodded, her eyes still on the drawing. "I used to sketch designs like this all the time, but after the accident, I stopped." "Why did you stop?" Grace's voice caught. "Robert, he said I should focus on getting better. That dreaming about work would only frustrate me." Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral. "How did that make you feel?" "I thought he was being supportive," Grace said slowly. "But now, I wonder if he was trying to make me dependent on him." As the realization hit her, Grace felt a dam break inside. Years of suppressed emotions flooded out. She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. Dr. Chen waited patiently, offering a box of tissues when Grace's tears began to subside. "I'm sorry," Grace said, wiping her eyes. "Don't apologize," Dr. Chen replied. "This is an important step in your healing process." Over the next few sessions, Dr. Chen encouraged Grace to continue drawing. Each sketch revealed more of her suppressed passion for architecture and design. "Grace," Dr. Chen said during their fourth session, "have you considered returning to work?" Grace hesitated. "I don't know if I can. My reputation." "Your skills haven't changed," Dr. Chen pointed out. "Your perspective has. That could be an asset in accessible design." For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a spark of hope. "Maybe," she said, "I'll think about it." As their sessions continued, Grace began to recognize patterns in her relationship with Robert that she'd previously overlooked. The way he'd subtly undermined her confidence, isolated her from friends and family, controlled their finances. "It's called gaslighting," Dr. Chen explained. "It's a form of psychological manipulation." Grace felt a mix of anger and relief at having a name for what she'd experienced. "How did I not see it?" "Gaslighting is insidious," Dr. Chen said. "It happens gradually, but recognizing it now shows your strength." Grace pondered this. She thought about the challenges she'd overcome in her career, the obstacles she'd faced after her accident. Slowly, she began to reconnect with the determined, resourceful woman she'd once been. During their final session, Dr. Chen asked Grace about her plans. "I'm going to restart my practice," she said, a note of determination in her voice. "Accessible design isn't just a niche anymore. It's the future." Dr. Chen smiled. "You've come a long way, Grace. Remember, healing is a process. There will be difficult days ahead, but you have the strength to face them." As Grace left Dr. Chen's office, she felt a mix of apprehension and excitement. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since Robert's betrayal, she felt ready to face it. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Sophie? It's Grace Sullivan. Remember that internship we discussed before my accident? Is the offer still open?" As she hung up, Grace allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Grace wheeled herself into the police station, her heart pounding. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, but now that it was here, she felt a wave of uncertainty. Officer Johnson greeted her. "Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for coming in. Are you ready to make your statement?" Grace nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, I am." For the next hour, Grace recounted the events of that fateful night. She described Robert's deception, the drive to Hartford, and his cruel abandonment. With each word, she felt a mixture of pain and relief. "We'll investigate this thoroughly, Mrs. Sullivan," Officer Johnson assured her. "What your husband did is a serious offense." As Grace left the station, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had taken the first step towards justice. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Millbrook Rehabilitation Center. Dr. Lisa Patel, the lead therapist, welcomed her. "We've designed a program specifically for you, Grace," Dr. Patel explained. "It includes physical therapy, occupational therapy, and counseling." Grace's days quickly filled with grueling therapy sessions. She pushed herself to the limit, determined to regain as much independence as possible. The work was hard, but with each small victory, Grace felt her confidence growing. During her free time, Grace found herself drawn back to her sketchpad. She began to experiment with new designs, reimagining spaces to be more accessible. Her hands, once hesitant, moved with increasing surety across the paper. One afternoon, Grace stared at her latest sketch, a public park designed for universal access. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Millbrook Architects, how may I help you?" A voice answered. "This is Grace Sullivan," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'd like to speak with Tom Harrison, please." There was a pause on the line. "Oh, Mrs. Sullivan, I'm not sure if Mr. Harrison is available." Grace frowned. "Is there a problem?" No, the receptionist quickly replied. I'll see if he's in." After a long wait, Tom's voice came on the line. "Grace? This is unexpected." "Tom, I've been working on some new designs," Grace began. "I think they could be valuable for the firm's accessibility projects." There was an uncomfortable silence. "Grace, I'm not sure. There have been some concerns about your stability." Grace felt as if she'd been slapped. "What do you mean?" Tom sighed. "Robert told us about your difficulties. He said you were struggling to cope." Anger surged through Grace. "Robert lied, Tom. He abandoned me on the streets of Hartford. I filed a police report." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I see," Tom finally said. "Grace, I think we need to have a longer conversation about this. Can you come to the office next week?" After hanging up, Grace sat in stunned silence. Robert hadn't just abandoned her. He had actively tried to destroy her professional reputation. The realization hit her hard. Her battle wasn't just for physical recovery, but for her entire life and career. That evening, Grace made another difficult call. The phone rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "Mom?" Grace said, her voice wavering. "Grace? Oh, sweetie, we've been so worried," her mother replied. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry I haven't called. Things have been complicated." Over the next hour, Grace explained everything to her parents. She told them about Robert's betrayal, her struggles, and her determination to rebuild her life. "We had no idea," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "Robert told us you were having mental health issues, that you needed space." Grace felt a mix of anger and relief. "I'm getting better, Dad, and I'm going to need your support." "You have it, sweetheart," her mother assured her. "Always." As Grace ended the call, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had a long way to go, but she wasn't alone anymore. The next day in therapy, Dr. Patel noticed a change in Grace's demeanor. "You seem more determined today," she observed. Grace nodded. "I am. I've realized that my recovery isn't just physical. I need to reclaim my whole life." Dr. Patel smiled. "That's an important realization, Grace. It won't be easy, but I believe you're up for the challenge." As Grace wheeled herself back to her room, she felt a newfound sense of purpose. The road ahead was daunting, filled with physical and professional challenges. But for the first time since Robert's betrayal, Grace felt ready to face them. She pulled out her sketch pad, flipping to a blank page. It was time to start designing her new life, one line at a time. Grace sat at her makeshift desk, staring at her phone. She had spent the morning calling former clients, hoping to secure new projects. The phone finally rang. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is John from Greenfield Development," a hesitant voice said. "We've decided to go in a different direction. Given your recent circumstances, we feel it's best to work with someone else." Grace's grip tightened on the phone. "My recent circumstances? What exactly do you mean by that?" "We've heard some concerning things about your health, your reliability. I'm sorry, but we can't take the risk." The call ended, leaving Grace stunned. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find a young woman standing there. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Sophie Chen, the intern from Millbrook Architects," Sophie explained. "Mr. Harrison sent me to assist you with your projects." Grace was about to dismiss her when she noticed the determination in Sophie's eyes. "Come in," Grace said, relenting, "but I can't pay you." As they worked on a small pro bono project for a local nonprofit, Grace found herself opening up to Sophie. She shared her frustrations with the industry and the clients who now shunned her. Their work was interrupted by Grace's landlord. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're 2 months behind on rent," he said. "If you can't pay by the end of the week, I'll have to start eviction proceedings." After he left, Sophie asked hesitantly, "Is there anything I can do?" Grace shook her head. "Unless you can convince my ex-husband to unfreeze our joint accounts or find me a paying client in the next 3 days, I don't think so." As they brainstormed options, Grace's phone rang. It was Tom Harrison from her old firm. "Grace, there's something you need to know about the riverfront project," Tom said. "There was an accident at the site. A section of the accessible ramp collapsed. 2 people were injured." Grace felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. "That's impossible. I checked those calculations 100 times. We found discrepancies in the final plans," Tom explained. "Changes that weren't in your original design, changes that compromised the structure's integrity." The implication hung in the air. Robert had access to all her work. He had the skills to make subtle changes that wouldn't be noticed until it was too late. "Tom, I need to see those plans," Grace said, her voice shaking. "I need to prove I didn't do this." After hanging up, Grace explained the situation to Sophie. The young woman's face paled as she realized the implications. "He sabotaged your work?" Sophie asked, incredulous. "But why?" "To discredit me. To make sure I couldn't succeed without him." As the reality of the situation sank in, Grace felt overwhelmed by guilt and frustration. Sophie, seeing Grace's distress, placed a hand on her shoulder. "This isn't your fault, Mrs. Sullivan. We'll prove it wasn't your design that failed." Grace nodded, trying to gather her thoughts. "We need to go through every project I worked on in the last year of my marriage. If Robert sabotaged the riverfront project, he might have tampered with others too." Days turned into weeks as Grace and Sophie worked tirelessly. They found subtle alterations in several projects, changes that would have gone unnoticed until it was too late. With each discovery, Grace's anger grew, but so did her resolve. One evening, Sophie hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Sullivan, how did you not notice these changes before?" Grace sighed. "Robert was very manipulative. He would volunteer to submit the final plans, saying he wanted to take work off my plate. I trusted him. I never imagined he would do something like this." Sophie nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry. It must be hard to have trusted someone so much, only to have them betray you like this." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, Sophie, when Robert first left me, I thought my life was over. I felt helpless, useless. But working with you these past weeks, uncovering the truth, it's reminded me of who I am, of what I'm capable of." Sophie smiled. "You're an incredible architect, Mrs. Sullivan, and an even more incredible person. We're going to fix this, and then we're going to show the world what you can do." As Sophie left for the night, Grace wheeled herself to the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, no longer feeling oppressive. Instead, they seemed to hold the promise of new possibilities. Grace knew the road ahead would be challenging. She still had financial hurdles to overcome, a reputation to rebuild, and justice to seek. But for the first time in months, she felt truly hopeful. With allies like Sophie by her side and her own determination rekindled, Grace was ready to face whatever tests lay ahead. She turned back to her desk, where the plans for their community garden project lay spread out. Tomorrow, they would present the design to the nonprofit organization. It wasn't a big project, but it was a start. And for Grace, it was a step towards reclaiming her life and her passion. Grace's phone rang early one morning. It was Tom Harrison from her old firm. "Grace, I have news," Tom said. "The Hartford City Council is looking for proposals to revitalize their downtown area. They're emphasizing accessibility. I recommended you for the project." Grace felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Thank you, Tom. When's the presentation?" 2 weeks from now. I'll email you the details." After hanging up, Grace called Sophie. We have a big opportunity, she explained, but we'll need to work around the clock to prepare. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace and Sophie poured themselves into the proposal. They researched Hartford's demographics, studied the city's infrastructure, and brainstormed innovative accessibility solutions. The day of the presentation arrived. Grace wheeled into the city council chamber, Sophie following with their materials. The room was filled with council members and other architects competing for the project. As Grace set up, she overheard whispers from nearby. "Isn't that the architect who had a breakdown? I heard her designs caused accidents. Can someone in her condition really handle a project this big?" Grace felt her confidence waver. Sophie, noticing her discomfort, leaned in. "Remember why we're here," she whispered. "You have something unique to offer." The presentations began. Grace watched as her competitors showed sleek designs that, while aesthetically pleasing, lacked true understanding of accessibility needs. Finally, it was Grace's turn. As she began her presentation, she noticed some council members exchanging skeptical glances. "Mrs. Sullivan," one council member interrupted, "your designs are interesting, but aren't they a bit extreme? We need to consider all citizens, not just those with disabilities." Grace took a deep breath. "Councilman, universal design benefits everyone, not just those with disabilities. A ramp that helps a wheelchair user also helps a parent with a stroller or a delivery person with a dolly." She continued her presentation, drawing on her personal experiences to illustrate the importance of truly accessible design. As she spoke, she noticed one council member, a man in a wheelchair, nodding along. After the presentation, this council member, David Chen, approached Grace. "Mrs. Sullivan, your insights are invaluable. We need more designers who understand these challenges firsthand." Grace felt a surge of hope. Having an ally on the council could make a significant difference. As they were packing up, Sophie nudged Grace. "That man over there keeps staring at us," she whispered. Grace looked up to see a council member in deep conversation with one of the competing architects. The man glanced their way, his expression hostile. "That's James Peterson," Grace said, recognizing him. "He's an old friend of Robert's." Sophie's eyes widened. "Do you think he's trying to influence the decision?" Grace nodded grimly. "Knowing Robert, it's more than likely." Over the next few days, Grace and Sophie anxiously awaited the council's decision. Grace found herself plagued by self-doubt. Was she really the best person for this job? Could she handle a project of this magnitude in her current condition? Sophie, noticing Grace's mood, confronted her. "Mrs. Sullivan, what's wrong?" Grace sighed. I'm not sure I can do this. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not capable anymore." Sophie shook her head firmly. "That's not true. Your disability doesn't make you less capable. It gives you insight no one else has." Grace considered this. She thought about all the challenges she'd faced since her accident, how each one had given her a new perspective on design and accessibility. "You're right," Grace said, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "My experiences are an asset, not a liability." A week after the presentation, Grace received a call from the city council. They wanted to meet with her to discuss her proposal further. At the meeting, David Chen spoke up. "Mrs. Sullivan, your proposal stood out. You've considered aspects of accessibility that others overlooked. However, some council members have concerns." James Peterson nodded. "We've heard some troubling things about your past projects. There are questions about your reliability." Grace felt a flash of anger. She knew Robert's influence was at play here. But instead of becoming defensive, she saw an opportunity. "I understand your concerns," Grace said calmly. "In fact, I've recently uncovered evidence of sabotage in some of my past projects. I'd be happy to share this information with the council and discuss how we can implement safeguards in this project." The council members exchanged surprised looks. David Chen smiled approvingly. As the meeting concluded, Grace felt cautiously optimistic. She had faced her challenges head-on and turned them into an opportunity to showcase her integrity and expertise. Leaving the council chambers, Grace realized that this project represented more than just a professional opportunity. It was a chance to reclaim her reputation, to prove her capabilities, and to make a real difference in people's lives. With Sophie by her side and her newfound confidence, Grace was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Grace sat at her computer, reviewing the final details of her presentation for the Hartford City Council. Her inbox pinged with a new message from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "The truth about Robert Sullivan." Hesitantly, Grace opened the email. It contained a series of documents, financial records, email exchanges, and altered project plans. As she scrolled through the files, her heart raced. Here was evidence of Robert's systematic sabotage of her work and their finances. "Sophie," Grace called, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." Together, they pored over the documents. The evidence was damning. Robert had been planning his exit strategy for months, gradually siphoning money from their joint accounts and subtly altering Grace's designs to introduce flaws. "We need to verify this," Grace said. "I'm going to call Tom." Tom Harrison was shocked by Grace's revelations. "Grace, I had no idea. We need to review all the projects you worked on in the last year of your marriage." Over the next few days, Grace reached out to former colleagues, piecing together the extent of Robert's manipulation. Each conversation revealed new depths to his betrayal. "He told us you were having a breakdown," one colleague admitted, "that you weren't fit to work. We believed him because, well, he was your husband." Grace felt a mix of anger and vindication. "I understand, but now I need your help to set the record straight." As she uncovered more evidence, Grace made a bold decision. She would incorporate elements from her sabotaged projects into her Hartford proposal, turning Robert's betrayal into an opportunity for innovation. "Are you sure about this?" Sophie asked, concern evident in her voice. Grace nodded. "It's risky, but it's also a chance to reclaim my work, to show what these designs were meant to be." With the presentation date looming, Grace contacted a pro bono legal aid service. She met with Sarah Chen, a young lawyer specializing in financial abuse cases. "Mrs. Sullivan, based on what you've shown me, we have a strong case against your ex-husband," Sarah explained. "We can file for financial restitution and pursue criminal charges for the sabotage of your work." As Grace left the lawyer's office, the weight of her situation hit her full force. She wheeled herself to a nearby park, her mind reeling. The extent of Robert's betrayal was overwhelming. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had systematically tried to destroy her life and career. For a moment, Grace considered giving up. The fight ahead seemed insurmountable. She was physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and still struggling financially. Was it worth it to keep pushing forward? As she sat there, doubting herself, a group of children ran by, laughing. Among them was a young girl in a wheelchair, keeping up with her friends thanks to the park's accessible design. The sight reminded Grace of why she became an architect in the first place: to create spaces where everyone could thrive. With renewed determination, Grace returned to her apartment. She threw herself into finalizing her presentation, channeling her anger and hurt into creating something truly innovative. Late one night, as Grace was working, she received a text from an unknown number. "Back off, Grace. You don't want to make things worse for yourself." Grace's blood ran cold. The threat was vague, but the implication was clear. Robert was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect himself. Despite her fear, Grace refused to be intimidated. She forwarded the message to her lawyer and doubled down on her work. She would not let Robert win. As the day of the presentation approached, Grace reflected on how far she had come. The woman Robert had abandoned on that cold street in Hartford was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever. Grace wheeled herself to her drafting table, where the plans for the Hartford project lay spread out. These designs represented more than just a potential job. They were a statement of her resilience, her innovation, and her unwavering commitment to accessible design. She picked up her pencil, ready to make some final adjustments. Robert had tried to break her, but he had underestimated her strength. With each line she drew, Grace reclaimed a piece of herself. She was no longer just fighting for her career or her reputation. She was fighting for justice, for her future, and for everyone who had ever been underestimated or cast aside. Tomorrow, she would face the city council. She would present her designs, knowing that they represented not just her professional expertise, but her personal triumph over adversity. Grace was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had approached the inmost cave of her journey and emerged stronger. Now it was time to show the world what she was capable of. The day of the Hartford City Council presentation arrived. Grace wheeled herself into the council chambers, Sophie following close behind with their materials. As they entered, Grace felt the weight of skeptical gazes upon her. "You've got this," Sophie whispered encouragingly as they set up their presentation. Grace nodded, trying to quell the nervousness in her stomach. She had prepared extensively for this moment, but doubts still nagged at her. Would the council take her seriously? Could she truly compete against able-bodied architects with larger firms backing them? As Grace connected her laptop to the projector, the screen remained blank. She frowned, checking the connections. Still nothing. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Sullivan?" one of the council members asked, impatience evident in his tone. "Just a minor technical issue," Grace replied, her mind racing. She couldn't let this setback derail her presentation. While Sophie worked to resolve the problem, Grace made a split-second decision. She wheeled herself to the center of the room. "While we're addressing the technical difficulties, let me give you an overview of our proposal." Grace began. "Our design for Hartford's urban renewal isn't just about aesthetics or functionality. It's about creating a city that works for everyone." Grace proceeded to describe her vision, using her personal experiences to illustrate the importance of accessible design. She spoke about the challenges she faced navigating the city in her wheelchair, and how these experiences informed her innovative solutions. As she spoke, Grace noticed the council members' expressions changing from skepticism to interest. Even without her visual aids, she was capturing their attention. Finally, the projector flickered to life, displaying Grace's designs. She smoothly transitioned into a more detailed explanation of the project, her confidence growing with each passing minute. However, as Grace concluded her presentation, one council member raised his hand. Grace recognized him as James Peterson, the man she had earlier identified as Robert's associate. "Mrs. Sullivan," Peterson began, his tone hostile, "your designs are certainly unique, but aren't they overly focused on accessibility at the expense of other considerations? And given your recent personal difficulties, can we trust that you're capable of handling a project of this magnitude?" The room fell silent. Grace felt a surge of anger at the thinly veiled attack, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Councilman Peterson," she replied, "universal design benefits everyone, not just those with disabilities. As for my capabilities, I believe my work speaks for itself. My experiences have only enhanced my understanding of urban design challenges." Peterson opened his mouth to argue further, but Sophie stepped forward. "If I may," she interjected, "I have some additional information that addresses your concerns." Sophie proceeded to present data on the economic benefits of accessible design, citing increased tourism and improved quality of life for all residents. Her intervention provided crucial support to Grace's proposal. As the presentation concluded, another council member, David Chen, spoke up. "Mrs. Sullivan, your presentation has been enlightening. As someone who has faced mobility challenges myself, I can attest to the importance of the issues you've addressed." Grace felt a wave of relief and gratitude. She had not only survived the presentation, but had made a strong case for her vision. As the council prepared to deliberate, Grace overheard a heated exchange between Peterson and Chen. It became clear that Peterson's hostility stemmed from his association with Robert, and he had been attempting to undermine Grace's proposal. Despite this revelation, Grace felt a sense of triumph. She had faced her challenges head-on and presented her ideas with confidence and conviction. Whether or not she won the contract, she had proven to herself and others that she was still a force to be reckoned with in her field. As they packed up their materials, Sophie turned to Grace with a wide smile. "You were amazing," she said. "The way you handled the technical issues and those tough questions, I've never seen anything like it." Grace allowed herself a small smile in return. "We make a good team," she replied. "I couldn't have done this without your support." As they left the council chambers, Grace felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The presentation had been a significant hurdle, but she knew it was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, turning her vision into reality and reclaiming her place in the world of architecture. For now, though, Grace savored the moment. She had stood her ground, faced her doubts, and presented her ideas with passion and expertise. Whatever the outcome, she had taken a crucial step forward in her journey of personal and professional redemption. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Grace wheeled herself to the plaintiff's table. Her lawyer, Sarah Chen, sat beside her, arranging documents. Across the aisle, Robert sat with his attorney, his face a mask of calm confidence. As the judge entered and the court was called to order, Grace steeled herself for the battle ahead. This wasn't just about financial restitution. It was about reclaiming her dignity and her future. Robert's lawyer opened the proceedings, painting a picture of Grace as a woman broken by her accident, unable to cope with her new reality. Your Honor, Mrs. Sullivan's accusations stem from her fragile mental state. My client, Mr. Sullivan, acted only out of concern for his wife's well-being. Grace felt a surge of anger, but maintained her composure. She knew her turn would come. When Sarah Chen rose to present their case, she methodically laid out the evidence of Robert's manipulation and abuse. Financial records showed the systematic draining of their joint accounts. Emails revealed Robert's calculated efforts to undermine Grace's career. Your Honor, Sarah said, we will prove that Mr. Sullivan's actions were not those of a concerned husband, but of a man deliberately seeking to isolate and disempower his wife. As witnesses were called, Grace listened to colleagues and friends testify about Robert's behavior. Each account added to the growing picture of his betrayal. Then, Melissa, the nurse who had found Grace on that cold night in Hartford, took the stand. Her testimony was powerful in its simplicity. I found Mrs. Sullivan abandoned on the street, confused and terrified, Melissa recounted. She wasn't unstable. She was a victim of a cruel act. Throughout the proceedings, Grace noticed Robert's confident demeanor beginning to crack. His eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, especially when Sarah approached the bench with a flash drive. Your Honor, we have video evidence we'd like to present, Sarah announced. The courtroom screen flickered to life, showing Grace's face. It was her video diary, recorded in the months following her accident. The court watched in silence as Grace on screen spoke about her struggles, her hopes, and increasingly her fears about Robert's changing behavior. As the video played, Grace locked eyes with Robert for the first time. She saw the moment he realized the depth of evidence against him. His face paled, his shoulders sagging. When the video ended, the judge called a brief recess. In the hallway, Grace found herself face to face with Robert. Why, Robert? She asked, her voice steady. Why did you do this to me? Robert's composure finally broke. I couldn't handle it, Grace. Your accident, the changes. I felt trapped. I wanted out, but I was afraid of what people would think. So you tried to destroy me instead? Grace's voice rose, years of pent-up emotion spilling out. You were my husband. You were supposed to support me, not abandon me and sabotage my life. Robert flinched at her words, unable to meet her gaze. For the first time, Grace saw him for what he truly was, not the confident, successful man she had married, but a coward unable to face life's challenges. Back in the courtroom, the final witness was called, Robert's former colleague, Michael Thompson. Robert often bragged about how he managed Grace's career, Michael testified. He spoke about altering her designs, saying she'd never notice. He seemed to enjoy the power he had over her work. As Michael's testimony concluded, Grace felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The truth was finally out in the open. In her closing statement, Sarah Chen summarized the evidence of Robert's financial and emotional abuse. She highlighted how Grace, despite the challenges she faced, had continued to innovate in her field. Your Honor, Sarah concluded, Mrs. Sullivan is not a victim. She is a survivor who refuses to let her ex-husband's actions define her future. She seeks justice not just for herself, but for all those who have faced similar betrayals. As the judge retired to consider the verdict, Grace felt a sense of peace wash over her. Regardless of the outcome, she had stood up for herself and spoken her truth. When the judge returned, his decision was clear. The court ruled in Grace's favor, ordering Robert to pay substantial damages and recommending a criminal investigation into his actions. As the courtroom emptied, Grace found herself surrounded by supporters, Sophie, Melissa, her lawyer Sarah, and others who had stood by her throughout this ordeal. You did it, Grace, Sophie said, her eyes shining with admiration. You stood up to him and won. Grace nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. We did it, she corrected. I couldn't have done this alone. As she left the courthouse, Grace felt truly free for the first time since Robert's betrayal. She had faced her greatest fear, confronted her abuser, and emerged victorious. The road ahead would still have challenges, but Grace knew she had the strength to face them. She looked up at the city skyline, her mind already turning to the Hartford project and the future she would build. A future defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she would create for herself and others. Grace read the email with disbelief. Her proposal for Hartford's urban renewal project had been chosen. Simultaneously, her lawyer informed her of the court's decision in her favor against Robert, ordering full financial restitution. With newfound stability, Grace launched her own architecture firm, focusing on accessible design. She hired Sophie as her first employee, recognizing the young woman's talent and dedication. An invitation to guest lecture at her alma mater revealed Grace's talent for teaching. Inspired by a student who approached her after the lecture, Grace initiated a mentorship program for architecture students with disabilities. As her firm grew, Grace became involved in advocacy work, pushing for changes in legislation regarding domestic abuse and disability rights. During one hearing, she encountered Robert. Their brief interaction showed Grace that she had moved beyond the pain he had caused, finding a balance between success and compassion. Grace's firm took on more projects, each pushing the boundaries of accessible design. She found joy not just in the work itself, but in its impact on people's lives. One evening, Sophie brought in a stack of letters from people Grace had inspired. A woman who left an abusive relationship after hearing Grace speak, a young architect focusing on accessibility because of Grace's influence. As Grace read the letters, she felt overwhelmed by the realization of how many lives she had touched. Her journey, with all its challenges, had led her to this moment of profound impact. Looking out at the city she was helping transform, Grace reflected on her path from that cold night in Hartford to this moment of triumph and purpose. She had discovered unknown strengths, forged new relationships, and found a calling beyond her original dreams. Grace turned back to her desk, ready to dive into her next project. She felt a deep sense of gratitude and determination, embracing the possibilities that stretched out before her. This wasn't just a professional comeback, it was a profound personal transformation. As she began sketching new ideas, Grace knew that her story wasn't just about rebuilding her own life, but about creating a legacy that would help others rebuild theirs. With each line she drew, she was designing not just buildings, but a future of inclusivity and empowerment. If Grace's journey touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of her story resonated with you the most? Have you faced similar challenges in your life? Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of triumph over adversity. Remember, just like Grace, you have the power to redesign your life, no matter what obstacles you face. Your next chapter starts now. Make it accessible to your dreams.